Let's talk Battlesuits, Fire Warriors, and annihilating the foe with high-tech weapons from range in a full review of the new Tau Empire Codex. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, where today we're talking Tau, and in particular going over each and every rule in the new Tau Empire Codex for 9th edition. I think as factions go, Tau certainly from day one of 9th edition were one of the armies that basically needed an update. If you're an entire shooting army, you need to have the durability and damage outputs to gun people off the midfield objectives and take them yourselves, and that was just something that the current codex was struggling to do. From a lot of the previews, I think a fair few people are concerned about the massive firepower that this new book can get, and I must admit it does look like a really solid boost for the Tau. A whole load of new and interesting special rules, massive upgrades to firepower and datasheets, though admittedly a few losses and some special rules that have just gone away completely. Here's a rough breakdown of the contents of the codex. In my reviews, I typically focus on the core match play rules, the ones that actually affect how Tau are going to be playing in Warhammer 40k at the moment. There are of course the other sections there, lore, miniature galleries, and crusade rules. I believe the crusade rules are largely focused around conquering new areas of space for the Empire, very fitting. Otherwise though, there's a whole ton of rules sections, a bunch of things that apply to the core army, new rules for markelites, drones and battlesuits, and perhaps the slightly surprising loss of the big Overwatch benefits that the faction used to have. That has been replaced though with some tactical philosophy rules. Mont'ka and Kauyon give you some really nice whole army buffs. There's 3 unique secondaries, a double page of stratagems, and quite well reimagined Septs rules, 6 of the main ones including the Farsight enclaves, and a fun little map based one for generating custom Septs where you can put some combos together. It does seem though that they've basically dropped the Farsight enclaves as a major supplement in this book. They only get just about as much attention as the other Septs now, though I've got almost no doubt that this will be because they'll want to include the Farsight enclaves in a campaign book further down the road, though in the meantime it does mean loss of quite a lot of options that were previously available to the enclaves. Otherwise though, we've got a fair few character upgrades, 6 Warlord Traits for the Tau and 3 new ones for the Kroot, a decent amount of Relics, signature systems that are a bit more useful than the previous versions. The prototype systems from the Greater Good have been reimagined. They're now points cost upgrades that apply to commanders, ghost kills, or crisis Shazvirs. All the other ones do appear to have gone though. And then there's a new section for the Ethereals called Invocations, as similar to quite a lot of HQ choices, the Ethereals have kind of become a chaplain listening, casting a buff on a 3+ to affect nearby units. Perhaps some of the most interesting changes to a lot of players are the datasheet and points changes though. Basically every datasheet in the book has been reimagined to some extent. There's several buffs to the profiles, and certainly to the weapons that they carry. Broadly points costs have generally stayed the same, a few have wiggled up or down a little bit, but in general the main power boost from the codex is coming from the unit abilities and not just from massive points drops everywhere. I think we'll start with some of the core rules changes, go through each of the rules sections, and then do the datasheets and points costs at the end. Overall though, it looks like a really positive codex for the Tau, plenty of good stuff to get your teeth into here. First up, here are most of the core rules changes of the army. As with quite a lot of similar armies in 40k right now, there are a few restrictions on the HQs that you can take. Same as before, 1 commander per detachment, or 2 if you're playing Farsight enclaves, but of course they can take no Ethereals. The objective secured rules haven't really changed much, troops choices get OBSEC, including Kroot, and there are a few other ways for other units to get it via character buffs and similar. We'll cover the Septs rules later, but basically the Septs are chapter tactics type buff plus a stratagem, relic and warlord trait, and auxiliary units like Kroot and things don't get a Sept tenet or the Sept keyword, but of course don't break a detachment from becoming a full Sept one. I've not listed it here as the buff doesn't exist anymore, but basically Tau have lost their Overwatch buffs pretty much entirely. In the previous Tau codex you could have units fire Overwatch for free nearby to other units that can, and Tau units could always fire Overwatch every single time. I'm afraid that style of play is just completely gone. The only real major buffs to Overwatch in the book are the early warning override option, which allows you to do it for free. I'm not really sure it's the worst change in the world, to be honest. It did kind of encourage Tau players just castling up massively. It was potentially quite frustrating to play against, but at the same time also not really all that powerful. There's just really quite a lot of ways that you can do clever tricks to mitigate Overwatch, like charging out of line of sight or similar. I don't think it's really going to break the faction though, to be honest. They've gained a lot of good stuff from this update, and other shooting armies have certainly done very well in 9th edition, even without boosted Overwatch. Units wise, Battlesuits have got a couple of major changes. Perhaps one of the nicest one is that they can now fire in melee, essentially similar to vehicles with big guns never tire. It really helps counteract one of the major weaknesses of crisis suits, was that if you tagged them in combat then their guns suddenly became useless. That was quite sad for a unit that wanted to be jumping into the fray. though any heavy weapons will be firing at a -1 to hit. Additionally, all battlesuits are now essentially infantry or vehicles. Crisis suits and broadsides are both just really big infantry now apparently, and ghost kills and riptides have become vehicles rather than monsters. For me, I think that's probably a good change. It always felt a bit weird when things that are specifically anti-vehicle weapons don't work well against a massive mech suit, just literally because it's got a different keyword. Being infantry is really nice for the crisis and broadsides though. It means that they can make better use of cover and move through terrain better. Drones have also seen a major shake-up in the book. Aside from tactical drone squads, drones now always operate within units, and generally they don't split off. There's a section on drone changes and how they operate within these units. They're just ignored for a whole bunch of things, including things like lookout sir, determining the unit's starting strength or their toughness value, and can never get objectives secured from any source. There's now a couple of stratagems for some of the common drone tricks. Drones can only deploy from vehicles from a stratagem now, so it means that just deploying them en masse isn't quite as good a strategy, and it's the same for saviour protocols. That's a one command point option to tank one powerful shot on a nearby drone now. Broadly speaking, I do quite like the changes. I think it always just felt a bit fiddly having loads of tiny drone units splitting off from all the various units, and maybe puts them a bit more back into the role of helper, as opposed to a crotch unit for the entire codex, where we saw things like just castles of riptides shielded in shield drones and little else. The Markerlight rules are a bit more simplified as well, and I think that it's a simple and effective one. For some reason they've made firing Markerlights into a mini action that's basically done instead of moving for most units, though any Markerlights that are on a vehicle, drone or pathfinder unit can basically still move and do the action. The action completes at the start of the shooting phase, and for each Markerlight in the unit, you pick an enemy unit and on a 3+ it gets a Markerlight token. It means it's really quite accurate now, even on things like drones. And then each time a unit shoots at that unit, you could opt to expend one Markerlight token, and that'll give you a +1 to hit. The vast majority of the Tau Codex all hits on 4s now, so this is a good way to make your most powerful units hit on 3s very reliably. I must admit I'm not entirely sure why they decided to make it into an action rather than just a shooting thing. I guess one thing it stops you from doing is putting a whole load of Markerlights down from a unit that came out of reserve, though I'm not sure if that's the primary intention for making it an action. I personally quite like the change. It gets you that big +1 to hit really easily now, rather than taking loads of effort to get there, and I think that that's probably better than the progressive table of loads of minor buffs. A bit more simple and effective, and they'll still be a core part of the list. Finally, we come on to the tactical philosophies, Mont'ka and Kauyon, which I felt deserved an entire slide of their own. So I'd say that these tactical philosophies are perhaps some of the most important buffs for the whole army. Really quite powerful rules, and you basically pick one of these at the start of each battle. Quite nice that you can potentially be flexible depending on what opponent you're fighting, though I imagine that a lot of people might just build for one of these. Both of them basically grant a movement phase buff, and also some extra damage up close when you're targeting the closest unit. Mont'ka only applies on battle rounds 1 to 3. It gives you some pretty awesome extra mobility by allowing you to basically advance every single turn, and counters having remained stationary for the purpose of shooting. It just means that your fire warriors, battlesuits, devilfish and vehicles can be zooming all over the board, and you should be able to get a pretty nice positioning advantage with that. Then when you attack an enemy unit within 18-inch range on round 1, 12 inches on round 2 or 9 inches on round 3, your shooting attacks get an extra AP -1, and you also get to reroll wound rolls of 1-2. That's a pretty powerful close range alpha strike combo. Should be really nice on things like fire warrior breachers or anything else that has to get close like Tau flamers. And I can see it being very nice for crisis units deep striking on turn 2 and lighting up the enemy. I feel like it might get played more than Kauyon, to be honest. Generally in 40k, if you're going to have a massive boost to your army, it's usually better to have it at the start of the battle rather than the end, as that basically allows you to get ahead, maybe damage and destroy more of the opponent's army, so they have less assets to use in later turns. Kauyon, on the other hand, applies to rounds 3 to 5. This one gives you a fall back and shoot boost, though you do get -1 to hit when you do. Pretty handy on a lot of units now that they can't fall back with fly anymore like they could in 8th. It means that tactically locking up any Tau units just isn't going to be a thing later in the game. Their damage boost is always within 12 inches, and it actually gets progressively better towards the end of the game. On battle round 3, you get unmodified hit rolls of 6 get an extra hit, then on round 4 it goes to unmodified 5s, then on 5 it goes to unmodified 4s, essentially double damage for anything hitting on 4s. Again, it's a pretty nice boost. It has to be targeted against the closest enemy unit, it can't just be anyone within 12 inches. Though I would bear in mind that battle round 5 is usually a bit less important for killing given units and might be a bit more important to jump on objectives. Still though, they both do seem really quite powerful. It might depend on whether you're going for a late game surge or an early alpha strike. I feel like I do prefer Mont'ka out of the two, but they both look pretty playable to me. Certainly some hefty damage boosts, and I quite like the way that they actually encourage a bit of aggression with getting in close. Next up, let's go through the character upgrades, and we'll start out with the new Tau Warlord traits. Previously, I thought that most of these were pretty bad, to be honest, most often perhaps seeing through Unity Devastation, the mild shooting buff that gives you extra AP on 6s to wounds. That one is still there, Ornvar can take it, and I think it remains kind of okay, though it now does only apply to core units. Otherwise though, we've got Precision of the Hunter. This one seems like a pretty great one to go on Crisis commanders, load them up with 4 weapons, and your commander casually gets to reroll all hits and wound rolls. Typically, unless they're advancing, commanders will normally be hitting on 2s, so the hit rolls is kind of okay, but just innate rerolling wound rolls when you've got some seriously powerful weapons to take is really nice. I can see this being very popular just to make one commander utterly lethal. Otherwise, we've got a Ghost Walks Among Us, -1 to hit and +6 inches to advance. Dark Strider gets that. Maybe could be nice on a Cold Star battlesuit winging around. Through Boldness Victory gives one core unit within 9 inches 6s to hit auto wound. Long Strike gets that one. And I do prefer this as a shooting buff to the Through Unity Devastation one. That's going to make a unit of broadsides or crisis suits punch far more wounds through than they normally should be able to. Next we have Exemplar of Kauyon. This allows you to redeploy 1 unit, or 3 if you selected the Kauyon tactical philosophy. As per normal with these rules, you can also put them in strategic reserve for free if you prefer. These ones are always powerful to get a positioning advantage, and that's the one that Shadowsun gets. Finally, we've got Exemplar of Mont'ka. This one allows you to hand out a buff to 1 Sept core unit within 9 inches, and that unit gets to reroll wound rolls against enemy units within 12 inches, or 9 inches if you didn't pick Mont'ka as your philosophy. Farsight gets that one, and that one again is a pretty spectacular boost to be putting on anything that's close range. Mass volleys of fire warriors or crisis suits with fusion blasters and flamers and things come to mind. Overall, I think that the Warlord traits are really quite strong for the Tau now. All of these seem very usable. I do like Precision of the Hunter. Redeploying units is always great, though it's a bit limited if you're not taking Kauyon. And Through Boldness and Exemplar of Mont'ka both seem like great damage boosts depending on how long range your firepower is. Interestingly though, that's not the end of it. We've also got 3 Kroot traits as well. Now the Kroot Shaper is an HQ choice, he can take them, and give a few other boosts to nearby Kroot. Master of the Hunt is an aura of 6 inches for nearby Kroot units to get ignores cover at enemies that are within 12 inches. I guess that could be worse on the AP0 Kroot rifles, but that does seem pretty limited in scope. It's not going to apply against quite a lot of targets. Pack Leader is for Kroot units within 6 inches to get a 3d6 drop the lowest charge. I guess maybe could be handy if they're coming out of strategic reserve or something. It'd certainly add reliability, but only add something like 1 or 2 inches to their average threat range, which I think is kind of passable. And finally there's Nomadic Hunter, where Kroot units within 6 inches counter stationary for ranged attacks if they didn't fall back, basically translating to advance and shoot with those Kroot rifles. To be honest, I think all of them are kind of usable. I'd probably prefer the last 2 over the top one, though I don't really think that any of them are particularly mandatory, not quite as strong as the Tau ones in my opinion. Still though, really quite fun that the Kroot can get Warlord traits, and of course it's all very fluffy if you are taking a full Kroot detachment and you want your leader to have a bit more character. Next up, let's have a talk through the Relics then. A lot of these tend to be defensive or movement buffs, as quite a lot of the more aggressive stuff has gone to the prototype systems, as we'll see. The Puretide Engram Neurochip makes a return. This one allows you to regenerate a command point for battle tactics or epic deed stratagems on the roll of a 3+. That will give you a pretty reliable chance of getting 1 per turn, so if you do want more CP, it's not exactly a bad choice to have somewhere. The Onager Gauntlet now looks very fearsome indeed. It's a strength 12, AP -4 and damage 3 melee weapon, and now it looks like there's no sort of restriction on how many times you can hit with it, so it's really not a bad combat upgrade on a commander that has 4 attacks. Genuinely, if you want a punchy tower that isn't just Farsight, then this seems like a really good choice. I'm sure there's going to be some disappointed foes when they engage your commander in combat and he casually punches them to death with this massive gauntlet. Next, the Multisensory Discouragement Array allows you to nominate 1 enemy within 12 inches at the end of your movement phase, and you roll 3d6 against their leadership. If it's greater, you can either take away their Obsec, half their move and charge range, or make them so they can only shoot the closest enemy unit. You do have to get somewhat close to deploy that, I guess, but if you are a Battlesuit commander trying to take the midfield objectives, that could be genuinely quite a good one for stopping them from having Obsec, and generally screwing with either movement or shooting is pretty handy as well. You can just pick whichever one of those debuffs is situationally most annoying. The Solid Impact Projection unit gives you a 4+ invul save, and the first failed saving throw that you make becomes damage 0 as well. That's not a bad defensive one, it saves you having to pay for a shield generator, and that damage 0 protection is actually seriously good as well. It happens every single turn, it's not just once per game or anything. Genuinely, that's going to be a massive deal if you do get hit by something nasty. Doesn't seem like a bad one for a commander winging around with 4 offensive weapons. Next we've got the Advanced EM Scrambler. This one gives you a 12-inch aura of not being able to arrive from reserve nearby, and you can pick one enemy unit in the command phase, and until then they can't use any aura abilities from other models. I guess it's handy enough, that one feels a bit too situational for me, plus you do have to get very very close indeed. Ortu's Lantern is a relic marker light for something like a Fireblade. When you complete the marker light action for that model, it does an additional 5 shots, I believe on top of the normal one that you'd get anyway. All of those hit on 3+, so if you do need a hidden source of marker lights, that could be quite nice. The Humble Stave is an ethereal buff. That one allows you to cast an extra invocation and gets you a +1 to cast as well. I think if you are taking a standard ethereal, that one's basically mandatory. It's just whether or not you want to take the standard ethereal and this, or one of the unique character ones. The Kindled Blade is a Fireblade's morale buff. It's a better bonding knife that gives you a 6-inch aura for fire warriors to auto-pass morale. I guess not the worst boost ever, you might well save a few fire warrior lives that way. Leadership mechanics I think are a bit questionable, but I guess it might be worth it if you're in the midst of an absolutely enormous formation of fire warriors and you've really gone heavily down that route. Next, the Neuroempathic Nullifier allows an ethereal to select one enemy unit. The unit has to be within 18-inch range, and on a 2+, that unit can't do any actions until the next command phase, and any actions that it was doing fail. Again, I think that one's a bit too situational for me. Of course it could be really powerful if you do manage to screw with an opponent's objectives like that, but even if you stop one unit doing an action, there's nothing really to stop another unit just jumping up and doing the same thing, depending on how many are available. Not really one I'd take myself. Finally, for the Tower Relics, we have the Begel Hunter's Plate. This one grants you a +1 to armor saves for the bearer, plus gives you a 5+ Feel No Pain type save on top of that, so again an extraordinarily tanky commander. I'm genuinely unsure which one I'd take out of this and that Solid Impact Projection unit. Again, this one's going to make a commander monstrously tough to shift. A couple of them can get 2+ saves just at base now, so having +1 armor on top of that is going to make it very very tough to kill, even for high AP weapons. Of course the 5 Feel No Pain is pretty excellent too. Finally we've got 2 Kroot ones, one called Kataktar, which is a Kroot rifle at 24-inch range, rapid fire 2, strength 5, AP -2, damage 2, and it's basically a sniper weapon, ignoring Lookout Sir, and 6s to wound give you 1 mortal as well. It seems that Kroot Shapers still only hit on a 4+, so it's still not going to be masses of damage. I guess at 12-inch range though, it does give him a little bit more of a ranged sting in the tail. Perhaps more interesting for the Kroot though is the Borthrog Lance. This is a once per game Kroot ability which gives you an aura of +1 attack and +1 strength, and that actually makes Kroot combat seriously meaningful. Every single 6-point carnivore now hitting with strength 5, AP -1 and a big 3 attacks. If you want your carnivores just punching spectacularly hard, I think that one's really not the worst pickup on a Shaper. Overall though, I think they've done well to improve the relic section compared with what it was. Plenty of these do seem pretty tempting to be honest. I really like both the Battlesuit durability boosts. Cancelling Obsec is nice, more marker lights is pretty handy. The ethereal one looks great if you're not taking a special character version. The Onager Gauntlet can create you a genuinely fighty character for a bit of countercharge, which is unusual for the Tau. And there's the standard Puretide Engram chip if you just want something to farm out a bit more CP. Lots of good options there. I think it's going to be fun to build commanders between these, the Warlord Traits and the Prototype systems, which we'll take a look at now. So as I touched on earlier, Prototype systems are the revamped version from the Greater Good. A little bit changed from there though, as now they're single model upgrades given to either commanders, Crisis Charspheres or Ghost Kill Charspheres. You pay the points cost here in addition to the weapon that you've got, and you get the upgraded profile or whatever else it does. First up we've got the Starflare Ignition System at 20 points. Cold Stars now have a once per game ability to jump into the air and basically re-deep strike again, and if there's any enemy units within 3 inches when it jumps, then it deals D3 mortal wounds to them on a 2+. I guess the idea is that your commander was charged in combat and then you can give them a bit of a parting gift as you jump away. I don't think that this one's worth it though really. That's a once per game boost, so you're getting D3 mortal wounds if you're lucky, unless your opponent somehow manages to charge you with loads of different units and then also fails to kill you. Unfortunately perhaps one of the worst on the list I think. Next up we have Sensory Negation Countermeasures. That one's 15 points, and that's for Crisis or Commanders. Once per game you make one enemy unit in engagement range -1 to hit in melee. Perhaps best on a Charsphere in a big Crisis unit that just got charged by something nasty. Seems pretty nice to make the unit just a bit harder to kill the first time something gets hold of them. though I think it's maybe a little bit take or leave at 15 points. Next we have the alternating fusion blaster at 25 points. This one's 12 inches, strength 8, AP -4 and damage d6 +2, and it basically gives you one of these beam attack profiles where if the attack hits, you roll a wound roll against every unit in the line that it draws across, so you could essentially skewer multiple units. I think Games Workshop always seems to overvalue these beam things. It's a neat little ability, it's quite fun that you get the d6 +2 damage against everything that it targets, but it's just really not worth 25 points over the 10-point cost of a fusion blaster. Next there's the DW02 burst cannon, which is 15 points. That gives you an 18-inch burst cannon at assault 8, strength 6, AP -1 and damage 1. That's normally going to be 20 points after you've taken into account the cost of the cannon, and I've maybe got a little bit more time for this. That does spam out a fair bit of decent anti-infantry fire. I think it could be quite fun to combine this with the Cold Star's unique burst cannon, which puts out 10 shots at AP -1 as well. That's a seriously shreddy commander for killing infantry. Next there's the Stormsurge plasma rifle at 20 points. Plasma rifles roll 1 shot at strength 8, damage 3 now, but this one also gets AP -5 and cuts straight through invul saves. Another slightly pricey gun, but particularly on a commander I can see that being quite good fun, having one shot that you just know is going to land and make an impact. The thermoneutronic projector is a relic flamer, 12-inch range and d6 +2 hits as is standard for tower flamers these days. It gets the boosted profile of AP -2 and damage 2 though. What I think is also quite fun though is that it also gives you d6 +2 extra attacks in melee at strength 4, AP -2, damage 2. So I believe that you could combine this with the Onager Gauntlet for seriously quite a fighty crisis commander indeed. Again, I do quite like that one, it looks kind of fun. The Dominator Fragmentation Launcher is 25 points, an airbursting fragmentation launcher at 24 inches that gives you strength 5, AP -2, damage 1, and this one hits you with a pretty serious leadership debuff, causing -4 leadership if you get any hits on the target. Often leadership mechanics are just a little bit underwhelming, but this seems like a really reliable way of making one enemy unit basically run away a bit. A pretty handy leadership debuff maybe for a Crisis Charsphere to hand out each turn. Next we have internal grenade racks at 15 points. This one gives you a 2+ chance to cause D3 mortal wounds against a unit that you moved across. Perhaps could be nice for a Ghost Kill or a Cold Star maybe. I do think to really be getting value out of this though, you'd need to be using it at least 2 times per game if not more. Again, maybe a more of a fun one than a super powerful one perhaps. The Resonator Warheads are 30 points on top of a missile pod. They basically make your missile pod assault 3 and strength 8 rather than strength 7, but really the main advantage is that they halve the movement of an infantry, beast or cavalry unit that's hit by this model. The damage buff isn't really all that much to write home about, but just having the power to basically just shoot down an enemy unit and make sure it's moving a bit slower and not getting into the game as fast could be kind of important. That could seriously annoy some fast movers trying to move up, and if you can keep some key enemies out of the game for a turn, then it could well be points well invested. Then we have the EH Disruption Suite. This one's 30 points, and it's a Ghost Kill one, which is a once per game ability where you screw with any stratagems that opponents were trying to use on units where they shoot or fight. Basically any of those type stratagems cost 1 more command point than they would normally if they want to use them within that range. A pretty weird ability that we've not really seen much else anywhere else in 40k. Again, for me that does seem kind of situational for 30 points. It could definitely be super annoying against the right opponent and if you manage to get the Ghost Kill right into the middle of their army. But I feel it's maybe just overcommitment to disruption, and losing those 30 points and mispositioning a Ghost Kill might well cost you more disruption than it causes your opponent. At the end of the day, all this could add up to is just 1 more command point spent on one stratagem if they still absolutely need to use one on one unit in range. The Stim Injector is 10 points, and when the bearer loses a wound, you can activate it for a turn. It gives the bearer a 4+ Feel No Pain type save that lasts until the end of the turn. That one's only for a commander or a crisis suit, so I'm afraid you're not going to be using that on Ghost Kills, but for something like a commander, I think that could be a really nice little durability upgrade. It'll basically make the model twice as hard to kill on the turn that he's first targeted, and as often in 9th edition, the turn that they're first targeted tends to be the turn that things die. I think for 10 points that seems absolutely great. Finally, we have the Wide Spectrum Scanners for 20 points. This one's for a model with an early warning override, and it basically gives you the old rules for this bit of gear, allowing you to immediately shoot enemies coming in from reserve within 12 inches. I guess this could be quite nice area denial on a Ghost Kill maybe. Could just make it that little bit better at defending objectives that it parks itself on the edge of a board, but I feel that you're locking in 20 points that's going to be kind of useless against a lot of enemies. Plenty of armies just don't really use reserves in any major way at all, and a lot of the ones that do can just happily deep strike something somewhere else. They don't have to go after your Ghost Kill if they don't want to. Overall for these, I think it's a bit of a mixed bag. Some of them are great, some of them are really quite underwhelming. For the points, I think the Stim Injector perhaps is one of the best at just 10 points. And maybe out of the weapons, some of my favourite are the Plasma Rifle, Burst Cannon and Missile Pod upgrades. In any case, they generally seem a bit more fun to stack even more power on a strong commander. I feel like there's lots of potential builds that you could go after with this. It's going to be interesting to see what people take. Next up, while we're on the subject of characters, I thought it might be fun to touch on those Ethereals invocations. And just to put it in context, Ethereals have seen a few datasheet changes. They're 60 points now from 55, the leadership has boosted to leadership 10 from 9. They're a bit fightier with their Honour Stave. The Hover Drone's a 5-point upgrade to give you 10-inch movement, and they've got an Inspired to Greatness ability, allowing one core unit within 6 inches to shoot while doing actions. Previously, they could activate different elemental buffs that allowed you to pick and flex each turn. Now they're pretty similar to Chaplain Litanies. Each Ethereal can pick 2, and is able to invocate 1 on a 3+ each command phase. I think though if you are using Ethereals, you'll either take the Relic to have them cast 2 and also on a 2+, or take one of the characters that can also do the same. The first 3 of these apply to one core unit within 6 inches, the other 3 are a bit different. Storm of Fire is one that allows you to shoot while doing actions. If I'm reading all the rules right, this one seems a little bit redundant to me. It seems basically another copy of Inspired to Greatness, just in case you needed lots of units doing actions all right next to each other. Sense of Stone seems great though. It gives you a 5+ Feel No Pain type save. That one is going to be absolutely great on crisis units and broadsides. Broadsides with their 2+ armor save in cover with this are going to be a right nightmare to shift. Zephyr's Grace gives you -1 to hit provided the unit didn't stand still. Not bad on some fast moving crisis suits or fire warriors moving up maybe. Power of Tides is an auxiliary related one. You pick one auxiliary unit and that gets +1 to wounds. That seems really quite nice on a Kroot unit. They've got mass strength 4 attacks both at range and in melee, so +1 to wound in both of those seems pretty excellent value just for one cast. It does seem quite nice on Vespid Neutron Blasters too. Next we have Unifying Mantra. This one's an aura for core units to reroll morale tests and get +1 to combat attrition. I guess that could save a few lives. Again, as a leadership thing, I'd rank it lower than most of the rest. And finally, Wisdom of Guides, which is a nice simple gain 1 command point. I guess if you're not using the Puretide Engram chip to farm them, then this could be a decent option. Overall, I think that these abilities look very, very strong for the points cost of the Ethereal. Unless you're playing Farside Enclaves, they seem like a really strong inclusion. I think my favourite 2 are the Sense of Stone for the 5+ Feel No Pain, and the Wisdom of Guides for the command point. An Ethereal with the Relic just farming out those 2 all game seems like it'd certainly be worth the 60-point cost, though I think that Zephyr's Grace and Power of Tides both look usable too. In any case, Ethereals do look pretty handy to have around at the moment. Next up, let's talk through the 6 major Tau Septs, each of which get a Tenet, Warlord Trait, Relic and Stratagem. The Tau Sept has a fair few special characters associated, say for example Longstrike and Darkstrider. Their Tenet has changed really quite a lot. They used to be the 5+ Overwatch one. Probably for the best that that's changed now. Overwatch isn't as relevant with the loss of that for the greater good rule. Now they're a small damage buff, including every time you attack re-rolling 1 hit or wound roll, and also a +3-inch buff to auras and command phase abilities. The extra damage is kind of handy. It works particularly well with some of the absolutely massive scary weapons that you can deploy now, like that Hammerhead Railgun, and the aura buff certainly does help out various command units. Their Warlord trait gives you a 5+ Feel No Pain, so it can be another good way to get that if you've not taken the Relic. The Relic's some vectored thrusters for battlesuit movement, gives you +2-inch movement, and the potentially quite gamey option of doing a move when you're charged, meaning that this battlesuit should be near enough vulnerable to melee unless it's actually surrounded with enemy units and you don't have anywhere safe to move to. The Stratagem's been a fair bit improved though. Focused Fire gives you a +1 to wound against the enemy. When the enemy loses a wound, you get +1 to wound for all Tau core units targeting the same thing. This one used to be 3 command points, it was honestly just a little bit pricey for what it does, even if the buff is really quite powerful. Now at 2 command points it's a lot more usable. If the enemy has a massive unit that you just really need to focus down, this one could have some solid value. Still seems like a good Septs to pick, particularly with its access to a few more special characters than some. Viola's Tenet gives you +2-inch movement turn 1 for all the units that started in your deployment zone. Quite a solid first turn speed boost, particularly when you could combine that with Mont'ka for advancing as well. As well as that, you re-roll advances and charges, so works even better with Mont'ka. You could have things like crisis suits moving an average of around about 16 inches and still being able to shoot without penalty, really quite fast on turn 1. I'm not 100% convinced about how well it weighs up against more whole game abilities though really. Otherwise the Warlord trait allows a bit of command point farming, kind of similar to the Pure-Tide Engram Neurochip, except the command points are refunded on Strategic Ploy and War Gear Stratagems. The Relics are bonus attack from your commander model in the shooting phase. On a 2-4, the nearest enemy unit takes 1 mortal wound, and on a 5+, they take D3 mortal wounds. To be honest, I think there's probably better relics than that. And finally, their stratagem for 2 CP is Hot-Blooded. Non-drone models in the unit get 6s to wound, causing 1 mortal wound on the enemy, up to a maximum of 6. That one's seriously quite nice on any really high shot units out there. Having a big unit of missile broadsides with a marker light in tow, that should give you a very reasonable chance of getting you the 6 mortal wounds. I'd say perhaps the stratagem is the biggest reason to take Viola compared with some of the rest. Next up, Sakir's trait makes them a bit more stealthy and harder to hit. You get dense cover at greater than 12 inches or greater than 18 inches away for vehicles. Vehicles and battlesuits also don't get the -1 shooting in melee penalty for firing heavy weapons. A bit of extra durability at range certainly doesn't hurt. I think the buff for shooting in engagement range though is a bit passable. Their Warlord trait is to grant Obsec to 1 unit within 9 inches, usually a fairly powerful thing to put on elite units advancing forward. Their relic means that engaged enemies fight last, and a -1 to hit the bearer of the relic in melee. Of course, town melee isn't usually the biggest deal, but I guess that could be pretty powerful supporting something like some Kroot, or even just allowing a bunch of crisis suits to better bully some really light infantry. Finally, their stratagem for 1 command point is Orbital Uplink. You basically choose 1 enemy unit, and then all your Sakir units will ignore cover against that 1 target. Quite a nice boost there. Sometimes that can be pretty meaningful, say if you're shooting something like Eldar Rangers, or something else that gets better buffs than light cover that is normal. Overall though, I'm not convinced it's one of the Septs that I'm the most drawn to. Possibly the best thing is that Warlord trait for the Obsec. Next up is the Delith, probably the one that you're going to take if you want to make auxiliaries work. Their tenet gives them light cover for infantry at range, so good for crisis suits, broadsides and fire warriors. Auxiliary units don't get that, but the auxiliary units in your force do get the benefit of Mont'ka or Kauyon, and to be honest both of them will really like Mont'ka indeed. Both the Kroot and Vespid are likely to be getting close and unleashing a bit of close range firepower. It's pretty nice for Kroot who want to be going for objectives, not to have to choose between advancing and shooting their guns. Their Warlord trait gives you a 6-inch aura of +1 leadership, and auxiliary units within that range can also use marker lights for +1 to hit. Maybe that could be fun on some deep striking Vespid or something. Their relic's a stealthy one, meaning the bearer can't be shot unless it's either the closest or within 12 inches, plus you gain a 5+ invul save. That one could certainly make a jumpy commander get a bit more safe on the edges of the board. Hopefully most of the enemy's guns wouldn't be able to focus them down. And their stratagem is a 1 command point 1 to outflank 1 core or auxiliary unit, basically arriving somewhere within 9 inches of a board edge and outside of 9 inches of enemy units. Kind of a boosted strategic reserve there, or could be a way to get it on some very big hefty units that cost a lot of points. In general, I feel like they're the Sept that you're going to want to take if you're going to be running a whole load of Kroot. Maybe if you're not running a bunch of auxiliaries though, not quite as good as some of the rest. Next we have Borkhan. Their set tenet is a 4-inch range increase to all guns, certainly handy on a very ranged focused army, and a rather interesting defensive buff for vehicles and battlesuits, where anything that's strength 7 or less will count as 1 strength less than it really should be when it's shooting your model. Maybe a bit less relevant for some of the Tau vehicles, but really quite good for the middle toughness crisis suits. If you're being shot by anything that's strength 5 or strength 6, that is going to make quite a big defensive difference. The Warlord trait makes their own attacks AP -1 better than normal, and I can't see any stipulation against that not working with prototype systems or relics, so maybe it could be a fun way to get all of those burst cannon shots out of a cold start up to AP -2. And on top of that, 6s to wound give you 1 mortal wound each, up to a maximum of 3. Basically seems to be what you'd want on a commander with all the DACA, maybe more mass shots than just a few high strength shots. Their relic also soups up commander weapons. You get to pick 2 of your commander's guns and they get +1 to wound within half range. Again, that seems like it'd feed in very well to the exact same combo. No apparent restriction on taking relics with it again, though maybe not quite as big of a boost. Finally, their stratagem is a really interesting one. 2 command points for experimental weaponry. Basically 1 weapon when it's shot gets to ignore invul saves, which can be pretty meaningful on some of the really big guns that the Tau have. Maybe the pulse blast cannon on the Stormsurge might be one of the most choice targets. Overall, I think that Borkhan look like one of the stronger Septs. Their trait seems fairly useful if you're going fairly battlesuit heavy, particularly for short range weapons, and having an option to ignore invul saves at will is really quite a strong one. Finally, for the major Sept choices, we have the Farside Enclaves. As they're rebels, they don't get any Ethereals, but they do get 2 commanders per detachment, and as said, they are still only having the core Codex Tau options. They don't have any of their supplement content here. Their Septs Tenet Devastating Counter-Strike allows you to reroll 1 wound roll per attack, and also ranged attacks within 12 inches always count as having a marker light on the target, so they should normally be hitting on 3s. Means that you could maybe go a little bit marker light light with Farsight lists, incentivizes them to be brave and hard hitting, and that single reroll works really well with hammerheads. Their Warlord trait means that you can't use any rules to ignore the damage of the attack, so I believe that could be one way to get around things like Feel No Pain type saves, or the hard caps on wounds from Katana and stuff, plus any 6s on the wound rolls get AP -3 better than normal. I'm not really sure if it's enough for an all-round general damage output though to actually get taken. I think I prefer the full rerolls to hit and wound myself. Their Talisman Relic basically gives you the only psychic defense in the book, deny 1 psychic power per phase, and you get a +1 to that deny roll. And their Stratagem Drop Zone Clear seems to be a pretty massive damage boost for incoming crisis suits. The squad that comes down gets to reroll all hits and wounds when they're shooting, which is pretty mad given all the gear that they can take. It costs 3 command points if there's 4 or more suits in the unit. Overall though, I think that their trait is a pretty handy one. They really work well with getting close with Mont'ka, and that stratagem does look like a pretty devastating punch, even if it is a little bit on the pricey side. Overall, out of these main Septs, I think maybe Tau, Borkan and Farsight Enclaves look like some of the strongest, though of course it'll be interesting to see what people decide to build around, once they have had a bit of chance to experiment with the Codex. As well as the main Septs, there's also a system for creating custom Septs as well, if you want to reflect your own army. Again, it's the fairly normal system of picking 2 different options out of a list, but they've put a fun little twist on that, giving each set of tenets a sector, and you can only create Septs by picking 1 tenet from 1 sector, and then a different one from a different one that's adjacent. You can't take ones from, say, Sector C or E, as they're not adjacent on this little map. I think some of them are interesting, though of course I think you are giving up some options by doing this, as you don't get any associated relics, warlord traits and stratagems. Sector A are the ones that you can combine with basically anything else. They've got a rather nice pre-game move one that allows your infantry units to move 6 inches in the first battle round. Could be quite handy for some strike squads or breacher teams, and basically taking the midfield early. There's an objective Battlesuit one. Battlesuits count as 3 models, or big ones count as 5. There's a 3-inch range to auras and command phase abilities, much like the standard Tau Sept, and an interesting buff to assault weapons, where if you're within 12 inches they get +1 strength. I think a few of those are interesting. Moving forward early is always quite good fun. By combining Auspex with that Battlesuit model buff, then you could take some objectives a bit better. But I think out of those my favourite is the assault weapons one. It just seems like it's made if you want to run a whole load of flamer suits, you could have them essentially firing at strength 5 all the time. It's not too bad on the pulse blasters of the breacher teams either, that could be quite fun too. Sector B has infantry in a terrain feature, always counting as having dense cover if they're greater than 12 inches away. Between that and light cover, it would certainly make getting your infantry units in the right places into a really big deal. There's a melee defensive one, where AP -1 and 2 melee attacks count as 0 against you. That could frustrate a certain amount of enemy units, though of course is worthless against high AP stuff. There's ones for core units charging to gain objectives secured. Kind of fun, but usually Tau charging into melee is not what you want to be doing. And there's one for pulse weapons to get an AP -1 better if you roll a wound roll of a 6. A small damage buff there, but nothing enormously meaningful. It might quite often be less than a 10% increase in damage output. Sector C has flyer models gaining a 5+ invul save when they advance. This seems like it actually could be a fairly decent one with Mont'ka, say if you had some vehicles and battlesuits advancing around, still shooting on full potential, and having a 5+ invul save kind of army-wide for most of the first few turns. I think that's perhaps one of the stronger ones on the list. There's one for a 12-inch range ignores light cover, one for infantry falling back deal 1 mortal wound on a 2 to 5 and D3 on a 6. For me that one just doesn't really do very much. And finally one for burst weapons within 12 inches getting a +1 to hit. I guess in theory you could combine that last one with the assault weapons getting +1 strength within 12 inches. Means you could have strength 6 burst cannons that pretty much always hit on 3s. Still though, out of those that invul save is by far my favourite. Sector D gives you the Farsight Enclaves reroll 1 wound roll when shooting. Really not a bad one to pick up, particularly if you have some railguns or Stormsurges in your ranks. There's one for a 5+ Feel No Pain type save against mortal wounds, drones don't get that. One that kind of gets the Borkan benefit of vehicles and battlesuits having -1 strength for strength 7 or less weapons shooting them. Again, okay but situational, quite good if you're very battlesuit heavy. And one for missile weapons ignoring cover, things like missile pods and high yield missile pods. I think the single wound reroll is probably my favourite out of those. Finally, Sector E gives you a +2-inch move to fly units, +1 leadership and reroll morale, +3 inches when falling back, and the option for plasma weapons to deal mortal wounds on 6. To be honest, all of those I think are pretty underwhelming. Maybe the plus 2-inch move to fly units might be the best out of the bunch. Overall, out of these, I think that most of them just don't really compete too well against the main Septs. Maybe my favourite is the Fly Invul one for a Mont'ka army, though I'm not entirely sure what I want to pair it with. Maybe the plus 1 strength on assault weapons up close, or perhaps the plus 3-inch to auras, or the pre-game move maybe. Moving on, we come to the hefty section of Tau Empire stratagems. A few favourite ones have been reimagined, a few are gone, but compared with previously, there's really quite a lot of decent shooting damage boost options here for converting command points into dead enemy models. First up, the ones classed as battle tactics are Breach and Clear. That one's 1 command point. That one's for core Breacher team models, getting to reroll wound rolls and ignore cover. I believe it stipulates core models as it doesn't apply to drones, but just in general that's a seriously big power boost. Their pulse weapons are strength 6 and AP -2, so for just 1 command point that's going to pose them to be a fairly decent threat against most things in the game. It should even chip off a fair few decent wounds against hard targets with that. The Strike team get Relentless Fusillade instead. That's a similar one for the Strike team. They get to rapid fire all the way out to maximum range, which is now 36 inches I believe, and the AP of their shots gets improved by 1 as well. So I guess in theory you're looking at 20 shots out to 36 inches, strength 5 and AP -2. Next for 1 CP we have Onboard Sensors. This one's a pop-up Devilfish aura, giving you reroll 1s to hit against 1 nominated unit within 24 inches of the fish. I guess that's handy enough if you have multiple teams disembarking to try and take down 1 target. Even if you're affecting a couple of teams though, it isn't the most spectacular damage boost ever. For 1 CP we have Dynamic Offensive. This one's a Crisis Suit one. It gives you an automatic 6-inch advance, and no penalty to advance and shoot with assault weapons. Again, a pretty good one I think. Sometimes you're just going to need that extra movement to guarantee that they get onto an objective, or just nose into range with powerful guns like fusion blasters. I can see that one coming up every so often. For 1 CP we have Pulse Onslaught, yet another Fire Warrior damage boost. This one gives a core Fire Warrior unit auto wound with their pulse weapons on hits of a 6, and it sounds like you could combine that with something like Relentless Fusillade as well. Should guarantee that you chip away with a small amount more damage. I don't think it's ever going to be the biggest change in damage output, but I guess if you're going against a really hard target, it should give you a decent chance of just chipping a few more wounds off. Next, Fire Warriors are looking a little bit more dangerous to engage in melee as well. As for 1 CP, they can now point blank volley. This one allows them to fire their pulse weapons as if they were pistol too, so it could mean you could reasonably leave a squad into close combat if you've got enough of them left to kill the enemy, and just blow them away with guns there. Finally, for the battle tactics, we have Drop Threat Acquisition. This one's 2 or 3 command points, and it basically just seems like a worse version of the Farside Enclave specific stratagem. Battlesuits arriving from Deep Strike, able to reroll all hit rolls, 3 command points if there's 4 or more in the unit. Again, a pretty solid damage boost to threatening models, and of course nowhere near as powerful as the Farside Enclave alternative where you get wound rerolls as well. Still seems usable enough though for a big punch. Moving on to epic deeds, and first up we have Saviour Protocols, the new version of the drone rule. This one now happens after you fail a save for a target, and if you have a drone model nearby, that drone dies, but that attack becomes damage 0 for attacking the model. It's 3-inch range normally, or 6-inch range if the model has a drone controller, but interestingly enough this does appear to work on vehicles and things now, so you might be able to use it on your Hammerheads or your Stormsurges, and it's quite nice that you only have to commit the command point after the attack has actually breached your saves, and I think that's fairly high value on something that's very high damage. It'll be quite frustrating whenever this makes a big D3+3 damage weapon just basically go away. For 2 CP we have Branched Nova Charge, which means that when a Riptide fails its Nova Reactor roll, it can automatically pass instead. You can only do it once per model, and we'll get onto that a bit more when we cover the Riptides later. For 1 CP we have Combat Debarkation. This is during your Tactical Philosophy, Mont'ka or Kauyon, and it means that up to 3 Devilfish can basically move and then disembark their contents. Perhaps the most obvious use, just to zoom them up into the midfield on midfield objectives, disembark a whole load of Fire Warrior Breachers, and unleash a massive close range fusillade. If you're running Devilfish, this could be another very good reason to take Mont'ka. Doing that on turn 1 or 2 seems like it could be a real power move, and a good way to get Tau onto midfield objectives. For 2 CP we have Wisdom of the Many. This one's an ethereal one, and it's kind of the mirror of the Chaplain option that allows him to auto-cast a litany in some other phase besides the command phase. It's one that theoretically could allow you to get an ethereal in from reserve or out of a transport and still get one of his invocations active. For general use though, I think it is a bit pricey at 2 command points. I think you'd want to have something really specific that you need to do, Maybe something like get a big feel no pain on a big unit of crisis suits that's just arrived from Deep Strike maybe. Next up we have Failsafe Detonator for 1 command point. That one's an auto explodes on a battlesuit. You roll 1d6 per unit within 3 inches. On a 3 to 5 they take d3 mortal wounds, and on a 6+ they take 3. If the suit's a big bad battlesuit at 11 wounds or more, say a Ghost Kill or a Riptide, then you add 1 to that roll as well. I really quite like auto explodes type mechanics like this. Could be very nice to punish your opponent if they do have a whole load of assault units crawling all over your doomed suit. Finally, for epic deeds for 1 CP we have Backup AI. This one's a nice simple techno-heretical one, where basically the model counts as having full wounds for degrading purposes. Very relevant on a whole load of Tau units where the ballistic skill degrades. You don't really want them hitting on 6s if you can avoid it. It's going to make a real big difference on things like Hammerheads and Stormsurges. If you're running degrading profile models, then I feel that this one's going to get used semi-regularly. Moving on, there's a couple of requisition stratagems. These are the standard extra relics or warlord traits one command point each, and you can have 2 extra of both if you're playing Strike Force. I imagine that those are going to be quite popular. I think a fair few of the warlord traits and relics are very strong indeed now. Moving on to strategic ploys, and the first one is 2 command points for Orbital Ion Beam. This one's Games Workshop again trying to make the mortal wounds from orbit idea into something that you actually want to use. And it's only 2 command points, but I still don't think it's particularly strong. In your command phase you select 2 points on the battlefield, and you draw a line between them. In your next command phase your opponent just gets out of the way, but if for some reason they do choose to leave any models in between those 2 points, they've got a good chance of taking some mortal wounds. On a 2 to 5 they'll take d3, or on 6 they take 3. I guess could be annoying enough for a little bit of area denial, but still I'm just not enormously convinced that it's going to get used. Next up for 1 CP we have Wall of Mirrors, 1 for stealth suits and ghost kills. When they're within 9 inches of the board edge they can disappear and return anywhere 9 inches away from another board edge at the end of your next reinforcement phase. Having a few units that can do a bit of late game jumping around the board can be kind of handy. Not a bad one to have remembered in the back pocket if you do need these units to take the fight to the enemy back lines. For 1 CP we have Grisly Feast. This one's a Kroot one when they kill an enemy unit in melee, and they gain a 5+ feel no pain until the end of the game. I still don't think it makes them particularly tough as a unit, but for only 6-point models they really aren't too bad after this. Certainly makes them into slightly less glass cannons. For 1 command point we have Coordinated Engagement. 2 Sept units within 18 inches of one enemy must target that one unit, but they both gain an extra AP-1 when they do. Usually going to be most relevant on anything that's fairly low AP. Maybe things like burst cannons and pulse rifles could be the best choices. I think sometimes it's going to be amazing value for 1 command point, but a lot of the time it might be a bit restrictive, and you might just be wanting to split your fire, and that might genuinely be better. For 1 command point we have a Trap Well Laid. This one's a Kroot one, and it allows Kroot to heroically intervene within 6 inches, and when they do they gain +1 attack. That's really quite a nice one for Kroot that are going to be fighting over midfield objectives. It means that your enemy can't get too close to them unless they want to actually get engaged in combat, though I must admit I think there's a few targets you just wouldn't want to do this against anyway. Kroot aren't all that tough, and if your opponent does wind up fighting first before the heroic intervention, quite a lot of carnivores are likely to die. I'm not sure if you necessarily even need to get into an engagement range with this though necessarily. Could potentially be a very gamey way just to steal an objective from the opponent. Next up we have Recon Sweep. This one's a Pathfinder one, and you get +1 to hit with Marker Lights. Rather than 3+, it's 2+, and after they've done the Marker Light action, they can immediately move again afterwards. I guess that could be one way of keeping a whole load of Marker Lights safe. Have a big squad of 10 Pathfinders, move them out of some ruins, fire off their Marker Lights, and jump them back so they can't be shot. Maybe not the worst, as I guess they are at least somewhat fragile. Next up, for 1 command point, we have Shocking Firestorm. This one's another morale debuff one, and when 1 Sept unit targets an enemy unit within 18 inches, it means that any of their casualties they cause count as 2 for the purposes of leadership. That could well get a unit to the point where they might actually break for morale rather than not. Maybe something like a big Horde unit with good leadership like Necron Warriors might be a good target for this. If nothing else, I suppose it could make your opponent make hard choices as to whether or not to auto-pass morale for 2 CP. Next, for 1 or 2 CP, we have Counterfire Defense. The Counterfire Defense system is one of the Battlesuit support systems. Now it basically just gives you this keyword for this stratagem, and using the stratagem basically makes 1 attack become just damage characteristic 1 after they've wounded, but before you've made saves. I think there's plenty of times when that could be worth committing to. Say if you turn one of the D3+3 damage shots into damage 1 on a crisis suit, you've essentially just saved 1 crisis suit's life there. It does cost 2 command points though on big 14+ wound models, and at that price tag I'm not sure it's going to be worth it unless you're being hit by something truly colossal, something like an enemy commander's railgun perhaps. Finally, last up for strategic ploys, we have Strike and Fade. This is the Crisis Suit one for Jump Shoot Jump. Basically a jetpack unit can fire and then move 6 inches, 2 command points for 6 or more models in the unit. This one's a bit of a return to form from Tau suits from previous editions. Potentially allows your Crisis Suits to shoot an enemy unit, jump out of line of sight and not be able to be shot. Though to be honest, just as relevantly, it can just be a way to gain a lot of extra movement, an extra 6 inches towards the objectives or your goals. 1 CP really isn't the worst if it makes the difference between you scoring a few victory points or not. Lastly, we come on to the War Gear Stratagems. 1 command point for Frequency Lock. This one's the Seeker Missile option. Seeker Missiles are Strength 9, AP -3, damage 2d3 now. And if you've got a marker light on your target, you can use this to have them fire out of line of sight. The same for Destroyer Missiles or the Skyrays Seeker Racks. That has a nice little bonus regardless of whether or not you do have a marker light, you get +1 to wound with the attack. I guess it's handy enough if you've got a marker light that can see an important target, but the Seekers can't. For 1 CP we have Neuroweb System Jammer. This one's 1 unit with the Neuroweb Jammer keyword. I believe that that's one that you can take on the commanders if I remember rightly. But basically for 1 command point on a 3+, 1 unit within 18 inches is -1 to hit. A bit annoying that it's not really all that reliable, but could be really nice if you get to apply that to something really monstrous, something like an Imperial Knight. Next for 1 CP we have Repulsor Impact Field. This one gives you a -2 to charge 1 Battlesuit model. And to be honest, I'm kind of surprised that that's just handed out to any Battlesuit model in the army. It means that if your opponent tries to do a deep strike charge against your suits, you can just pop this and make that almost undoable. And it could well be worth a go if your opponent's got any sort of medium range charge that they might fail. Turning something like a 7-inch charge into a 9-inch charge is a whole world of difference. Next for 2 CP we have Ionized Shock Field. This one's an option whenever you manage to kill an enemy model with an ion weapon, whether it's an ion cannon or ion rifle or something, and that unit that you've killed it with can't be affected by any auras until your next shooting phase. At 2 CP I think it's a little bit pricey, plus you have to commit to actually killing a unit with an ion weapon, which might not happen. I guess if the opponent just has 1 massively stacked enemy unit that they're just going to be buffing with loads of characters, it could be worth it, but for 2 command points it seems very niche to me. Next we have the Hammerhead Railgun one with sub-munitions. This is the one where you give up that mighty railgun shot. If you've got literally no hard targets to shoot, then this could actually deal some fairly decent damage against hordes. You roll 1d6 for every model in the unit. On a 4+ they take a mortal wound for each, and then you even add 1 to the roll if the enemy unit's got 11+ models in. Seems like pretty great value at anything that's got 11 or plus in at least, but I would bear in mind whenever you're using this, you're giving up the absolutely enormous damage potential of the railgun, so most of the time I really don't think it's going to be worth it, unless you really don't have any hard targets to fire at whatsoever. Finally we have Photon Grenades, 1 command point for a defensive grenade stratagem, and basically a unit with the keyword getting charged by a non-vehicle or monster unit gets -2 to their charge rolls, and also -1 to hit. That seems like another nice way to keep your fire warriors safe. Again, could turn a easy charge into a hard one for your opponent, and hopefully might even give a few of them a chance of staying alive in the combat phase, depending on what's hit you. Again, seems like a good one to remember to me. Overall, I think it's a fairly interesting stratagem section as it goes. As with a fair few 9th edition codexes, maybe not enormous ones that stand out that you want to use every single turn, but quite a few that look like they're going to come up at least semi-regularly. I like the boosted movement for Crisis Suits, being able to reroll wound rolls with breaches. Savior Protocol still seems really powerful on big units failing saves against high damage weapons. The Command Debarkation one seems like a great whole army strategy to move up a bunch of Devilfish and put Fire Warriors where they need to be. Fighting on full wounds I think is going to be relevant quite a bit. Auto-exploding Battlesuits is pretty good fun, and Jump Shoot Jump could be pretty annoying both on Crisis Suits or Pathfinders. Finally, I think both of those -2 to charge stratagems are really relevant for Tau. Tau look like they're going to be a really annoying army to charge for any units charging out of Deep Strike. Perhaps armies like Blood Angels and Genestealer cults just aren't going to enjoy this all that much. Moving on, before we get into datasheets, let's talk about the 3 faction-specific secondaries for the Tau, and you can choose one of these instead of one from the main book. Aerospace Targeting Relays is a Shadow Operations one. Interestingly, you set up 1 objective marker halfway along every board edge. Interesting, as most of 9th edition missions make you have to set up objectives in the middle. Your infantry units can do an action within 6 inches of each one of them, and it's kind of a defend style action, completing in your next command phase. At the end of the game you get some victory points depending on how many you've managed to put down, 1 for 2 victory points, 2 for 6, 3 for 9, or the big 4 for 15. I think this one maybe seems okay. It looks like it could be quite easy to get a couple of them done. But the fact that you have to keep your units alive while they're doing them, I think is a little bit trickier. It does mean that if there's a vital one, your opponent could just really focus fire and gun down that infantry unit. I feel like this one's going to be a hard one to max if your opponent does have a fair amount of threat left on the board. Decisive Action is a battlefield supremacy one, where while your tactical philosophy is active, you get 4 victory points per turn for taking and holding half or more of the objectives on the board. I feel like this one is a bit of a twist compared with the Dominate one. You can only get up to 12 victory points with this, but if you think that you're only going to be active, particularly at the start of the game or the end of the game, it maybe gives you a bit more chance to really maximise those victory points and make it count early. I think for me though, I'd be a bit more tempted just by the 3 victory points per turn, unless you do have a really specific plan and you go all out to hold those objectives and you build your army around it. Maybe a better one for Mont'ka and Kauyon in my opinion. Finally, we have a Clean Victory, a No Mercy No Respite one, and again it either works in the Mont'ka or the Kauyon rounds, 1 to 3 or 3 to 5, where you get 1 victory point for killing an enemy unit in that round, or 3 victory points if you kill 3 or more enemy units in that round. For me, that one just seems really quite underwhelming. It's perfectly possible that you might well miss a turn of killing 3 enemy units, say you only killed 2, and then you're looking at a maximum of 7 victory points, even if you're completely destroying the opponent's army. I feel like usually the main book ones are going to be better than that. Again, I'd probably say that there's nothing too outstanding about any of these. Maybe Decisive Action is my favourite, but even then I don't think I'd really take it over the standard one for the 3 victory points per turn. Next up, let's move on into datasheets, and all the many and varied changes to the stat lines and weapons on the units. First up, let's look at the troops and talk Fire Warriors. There's still the 2 main variants, Strike Teams and Breacher Teams, though for some reason they've decided to take away any squad flexibility from them. They all have to be 10 model squads now. You can't just take them in 5s. I think that's a slightly annoying change, but I can see potentially why they've done it, as otherwise just fielding them in absolutely loads of 5s usually tends to be the way to go. Still though, probably a bit annoying for anyone who does have their army set up in smaller squads at the moment. In any case, the Strike Team is 80 points now, so 8 points per model essentially. They've had a buff to their standard pulse rifles, 36 inches and AP-1 now, so they do hit with a fair bit more bite. The pulse carbine remains AP0 and is 24 inches, 2 shots. The boost is handy on gun drones and things, but I don't think it's really worth it compared with the pulse rifle here. The squad's become leadership 8 now with the Char's Wii, and I think that's basically to replace the bonding knife rule. Finally, the rules for their turrets and drones have been altered a bit. Their support turret is now part of the unit, 10 points for a smart missile system or 20 points for a missile pod. Smart missiles are AP-1 now, and the missile pod's got quite a generalist profile, going to 30-inch range but AP-2. You have to do a slightly weird action to set up the turret. Games Workshop really do seem to be embracing actions in this codex to the max of their ability. Basically it means that you have to do an action to set up the turret, and then if the squad moves away, then it gets packed back up again. It's basically a fairly efficient firepower boost for when you're completely stationary. Drones wise, gun drones are now 8 points. They still must target the closest unit unless they have a drone controller nearby. The Guardian drone gets a 4+ invul, and it looks like it gives the unit a nice defensive buff, making them fail to be wounded on a 1 or a 2. Not bad if they're being shot by strength 6 or higher weapons, I suppose. Shield drones are 12 points, they're now 2 wounds and a 4+ invul now. Basically just ablative wounds for the unit, they don't feel no pain. And the marker drone is 10 points and has a marker light. You can also equip the Char's Wii with one as before. Generally speaking, the Breacher team is pretty much similar. Most of the changes are the same. The main different one is to the Pulse Blaster, which has now only got 2 range profiles rather than 3. The low threat is basically gone, replaced by the medium one out to 14 inches, and you now get 8 inches worth of Assault 2, Strength 6, AP-2 goodness. Really quite threatening small arms for such a cheap squad up close, though of course you do have to get them there. They are 5 points more than the Strike team now, 85 points for the 10-man squad, rather than 80. Overall, Fire Warriors are definitely looking stronger than they were previously, though I must admit not being able to take them in small 5s is a bit of a nerf. They're not going to be quite as good for doing grunt work now, as they've actually got quite a bit of investment tied up with them, and it means that we might see more Kroot at just 60 points as the cheapest troop slot now. Talking of which, I think we should go through the Kroot units in general when we're covering the carnivores, as they are kind of somewhat tied up together now. Standard Kroot I think just look massively better than they were before, and for just 6-point models they are very efficient indeed. You still get 10 to 20 models in a squad, but now their melee is decently amped up. They get 2 attacks hitting on 3s at strength 4 AP-1. That's genuinely quite threatening for so cheap models, even if they are fragile. They've gained a quill grenade, a strength 4 grenade that they can fire up close. They retain their pre-game move, but they have gained another couple of really quite helpful special rules, getting +1 to their armor save when they're in cover, for potentially up to a 4+ save when they have light cover. And also they do mean that you can take other Kroot units in the detachment very easily indeed. You can take 1 Krootox unit, 1 unit of Hounds and 1 Shaper, completely slotless, provided you have 1 squad of Kroot Carnivores there. I have a feeling that between all these abilities we might see at least some Kroot in most Tau lists. Being cheap OBSEC troops with a fair bit of melee bullying potential is probably enough to get them there. The pre-game move is very nice, though I admit that they are quite fragile unless you can get them in cover. Krootox Riders are 25 points now, remaining in the elite slot, down from 28. Their gun's basically a heavy 2 autocannon shot now, rather than rapid fire 1. It's probably better, as they're not taking the heavy weapon penalty anyway due to being cavalry. The biggest buff for the Krootox though is to their melee. They now get 4 attacks at strength 6 AP-2 damage to, so that's legitimately quite threatening for only 25 point models. It is going to mash up some elite infantry pretty well. They also get a pre-game move as well. Between their shooting and their combat, just in general they do seem quite efficient little units now, good for bullying any medium infantry with 2 wounds at the very least. Kroot Hounds remain at 6 points, they now have 3 attacks from 2, though still only at strength 3. They've gained a nice little mobility boost as they reroll all advances and charges innately now. It doesn't matter about their target having taken wounds like it was before. And like the standard Kroot Carnivores, they also gained the pre-game move and +1 save when they receive cover. I think that a couple of tiny units of these look really quite annoying now. Just for 24 points for 4 of these means that you've got a unit that pre-game moves at 12 inches, and they could just jump in the way of the enemy and stop their models advancing normally. They're not going to do much damage, but that sounds like a really annoying amount of disruption for just how few points they cost. Finally, we have the Kroot Shaper, which might just be one of the most improved units in the entire Codex. It's still only 25 points, and it became an HQ slot, so ridiculously cheap if you do need to fill 1 slot there. We've already talked about his Relics and Warlord traits that he has available, but his base gear is a Shaper Kroot rifle, rapid fire 2 at strength 4 AP-1. He can swap that for a pulse rifle if he desires, and then he's got the choice of either a Ritual Blade or a Grenade Belt. The Ritual Blade is strength +1 AP-1, and the Grenade Belt I believe is to represent Daek Grek, the Blackstone Fortress character. A one-use fairly potent close-range shooting attack, 6 inches and 2d6 shots at strength 5 AP-1 damage 1. To be honest, that kind of firepower out of a 25 point model seems pretty great if you can actually get to use it. I guess the only major issue is getting that close. Otherwise, he grants leadership to nearby Kroot units, reroll hit rolls of 1 for Kroot as well, and he also gets the pre-game move and +1 save in cover. He is still only a 25 point character, so isn't exactly massively outstanding, but just for the sheer amount of abilities that you get for this guy, I think he's a really easy pickup if you're using any Kroot whatsoever. I feel like his 25 points well spent. You can't really go too far wrong with him. Next up, let's talk Battlesuits, and we'll start out with the rock stars of the Tau Codex, the XV8 Crisis Suits. These guys remain 30 points for the standard unit, or 35 points for bodyguards. You can't any longer take them in massive 9 model units, they're only 6 max now, a change that's been seen in quite a lot of other codexes, I think mainly Games Workshop trying to limit the scope of stratagems to affect enormous units in silly ways. The bodyguards just really aren't all that different. The main difference is that they have the no shooting characters within 3 inches rule, so it can be quite nice if you do want to play fairly aggressively with some commanders. Just on their base profiles, the Crisis Suits gain +1 wound and a 10-inch move now. Plus, as we mentioned earlier, Battlesuits in general can fire in melee, always nice if you're going to get a massive unit tagged by some chaff. The war gear selection system appears to have changed a bit. It seems that you can get up to 3 different weapons and 1 support system on the same suit, though the way that you pay points for them is really quite different. The support systems are largely free besides the shield generator, so you basically just get to pick your favourite out of those and decide what buff you're getting. Though basically mixed loadouts are looking like the order of the day for weapons, as if you double up on loadouts, then the guns get progressively more expensive. Each of the guns has 3 different costs. The first one is if you just take 1 of that type of weapon, the next is for the second one, and the third is if you want to take 3 of the same gun. I think in general you'll never want to take 3 of the same gun due to this, unless you're really going down one strategy hard. It means, say for anti-tank duties, you might be mixing cyclic ion blasters, plasma rifles and fusion blasters, or for anti-infantry duties you might be taking mixes of burst cannons, flamers, and maybe some other stuff too. First up, the plasma rifle is one of the cheap ones. It's now a 36-inch single-shot weapon at strength 8, AP-4 and damage 3. Kind of a surprising pivot from that one. It always used to be a multiple-shot heavy infantry killer. It will still do that, though it seems pretty much equally good against tanks now. The air-bursting fragmentation projector is also quite cheap. Its damage output isn't particularly impressive with D6 shots at strength 4, AP-1, damage 1. You're basically paying a premium on this one for the ignores line of sight. Could be kind of handy to clear out some infantry hiding behind ruins and things, though to be honest maybe that's a role that just smart missiles are going to do better. Next, burst cannons are also cheap, starting at 5 points. They've received a big boost with 2 extra shots, and now assault 6 now, strength 5, AP0, damage 1. Burst cannons are just going to mow down light infantry now, but still won't be doing all that much to things with higher saves and more wounds. The cyclic ion blaster has gone to 10 points base, and it costs more for doubling up. I'm afraid I've made a slight typo on the slide here. Its base profile is strength 7, AP-2, damage 1, and assault 3, and the normal ion weapon profile of going up +1 strength and damage if you decide to overcharge it and risk taking some mortal wounds. Overall though, particularly on that overcharge profile, it is pretty much the flat best against the vast majority of targets, only really falling down a bit against -1 damage things, but of course it does cost a bit more and risks damaging your own battlesuits. Next, the fusion blaster starts at 10 points, it's 18 inches and assault 1, pretty much unchanged except for acquiring the new melter rule, getting d6 +2 damage whenever you can get within 9 inches. Might be quite a nice one for Borkhan that, it means that you could potentially deep strike greater than 9 inches away and still activate the melter rule in general. The missile pod's one of the more expensive ones, again starting at 10 points, 30 inches, strength 7, AP-2 and damage 2. Pretty much a jack of all trades, master of none. You pay a bit of a premium for the flexibility, but there aren't many targets that it isn't going to have a good time against. And finally there's the Tau Flamer, starting at 5 points, and it's actually quite a potent little flamer now. You get d6 +2 shots per flamer, at strength 4, AP0 and damage 1. You do have to get pretty close, but it will tend to outdamage the burst cannon against most hordes. Overall, I think they've done a genuinely quite good job of mixing up the unit profile. With the scaling costs for the weapons and the various different combos that you could put down, I think that Crisis Suits are going to be more creative to play than ever. I think most of the profiles are kind of usable. Maybe the Airburster does seem like it might be the most niche. The only thing is that it might take a fair bit longer to resolve their shooting now, not being able to just resolve mass weapons all in one go, and having to fiddle with a whole load of different suits with different war gear. The support systems have also been extensively rewritten as well. As I said, largely free aside from that shield generator. Some of them give you shooting buffs, some of them give you keywords for stratagems. The multi-tracker is quite a nice one against hordes. They give you exploding 6s to hit against any unit that's got 6 or more models in. Kind of a shame that this one doesn't really work with the flamer at all, it would have been nice. The counter-fire defense system unlocks that stratagem that we talked about, 1 CP to make 1 shot damage 1. The early warning override provides a 5+ overwatch. The target lock allows you to ignore light cover, not bad on low AP things I suppose. The velocity tracker gives you +1 to hit against fly units. That one is a very nice boost in itself, though if you do have quite a lot of marker lights in the army, it does mean that most of the time you won't be able to get multiple stacking +1s to hit. They cap out at just +1 in 9th edition. And then finally the shield generator, which costs 5 points. That one gives you the standard 4+ invul save. Quite a lot to choose from there. I think the multi-tracker, target lock and velocity tracker all look like simple ways to make the suits a bit more dangerous. And shield generators and that counter-fire system could both be used by maybe 1 or 2 models to tank some fire. Finally, talking of tanking fire, the Iridium armor is still about, still available for just 1 suit out of every 3. It doesn't appear to have any movement restrictions now, and it only costs 5 points. At that price, and now their infantry with light cover, that seems like a pretty much mandatory include on at least 1 suit out of every 3. You can also still take gun drones, marker drones and shield drones, which function as part of the unit now. Potentially could be useful ones to tank some very high power shots on. Overall, I think the Crisis Suits are looking solid. There's a whole load of rules that buff them within the Codex. I'm not sure if they're going to be flat out the most efficient firepower in the book, but on a decent platform with good movement and fly, I'm pretty certain that there's going to be a role for them. Moving on, and we come to the stealthy battlesuits. Stealth suits are 25 points now, down from 26. They got the big buff from the burst cannon, so a lot more shots out of them. And perhaps one of their most interesting rules is the 5-point homing beacon thing that they can do, which permits them to do an action on turn 1. Essentially the stealth suits remain still, and then you can deep strike a crisis unit within 3 inches of them right on the first turn, regardless of the reserve rules. It means that you could potentially play some high risk, high reward games in the midfield with these guys, putting them down and having some crisis suits join the fray early. Otherwise it's 5 points for a drone controller. This can now give 1 drone unit within 6 inches 4+ to hit, and any gun drones lose the target the closest rule, so pretty reasonable if you are planning on spamming a few tactical gun drones, and while retaining their forward deployment and -1 to hit, stealth suits also have +1 save when they have cover now. A little bit harder to dig out if they are loitering in ruins and things, as you might expect for things that you can't see. Overall not really enormously different, but certainly stronger just from the points and the burst cannons. The rest is all quite nice as well. Ghost kills have had some more sweeping changes though. They're up to 160 points from 145, gained a few nice stat line boosts, +1 wound to 12 wounds, gains toughness 7, and of course they have the vehicle keyword now. The stealth drones have made a bit of a power move though. They now just flatly mean that you can't even shoot the ghost kill from greater than 18 inches away because you can't see it. And it's quite nice that your opponent just literally cannot focus down the ghost kill unless they get up close and personal. Seems like it could be a good unit to be standing on the edge of the board, or going after corner objectives maybe. Its guns have seen a couple of improvements as well. The Fusion Collider is now 3 attacks at strength 9 and gains the new Melter rule, and the Cyclic Ion Raker is now 6 shots at strength 8, AP -2 and damage 3 when overcharged, both of them seeming like pretty convincing dangerous profiles. Finally, it does have a decent support system called the Flare Launcher now. This one costs you 15 points over the alternative, which is the Early Warning Override, and I think it's quite a neat one, giving you a 5+ feel no pain against strength 7 or higher weapons that target the bearer. That's a pretty massive durability boost at some of the best ranged weapons to kill it, though I must admit I think the Ghost Kill maybe has more to fear from melee, as a lot of the ranged weapons just won't be able to target it in the first place thanks to those drones. Next up in Battlesuit land we have the Riptide. This one's moved from the Elite's choice to the heavy support, and it's down to 240 points base from 260. The profile's not really all that different. It's now leadership 9 and 6 attacks base, and those attacks are just a little bit more meaningful. It's gained Riptide Fists, which are strength +1, AP -2 and damage 2, even if it still hits on 5s in combat. The shield generator now gives it a 4+ invul save all the time, but you can't any longer Nova charge up to a 3+ invul save. Games Workshop does seem to like keeping that away from really big models these days. And weapon-wise, the Iron Accelerator, now overcharged, is 6 shots, strength 8, AP -3 and damage 4. The burst cannon gaining AP -2 just at base, rather than AP -1. Really the biggest and most interesting change for the Riptide though is the Nova Reactor. You now roll 2d6 versus the Riptide's remaining wounds. If it's greater, then the Nova Reactor burns out permanently, though you can use that 2 command point stratagem to keep it active. Otherwise, if you're successful, you get to pick one of these 3 buffs, either a 5+ feel no pain, the option to jump shoot jump a bit, moving 2d6 inches in the charge phase instead of making a normal charge, or just amp up its weapon systems, giving you an extra 2 Ion Accelerator shots or 4 burst cannon shots. Overall, I perhaps get the impression that the Riptide is going to be a lot more of just a massive tanky unit now. I don't think it's really going to outdamage quite a lot of the other big guns of the Tau Empire Codex, but between a bunch of wounds, a 4+ invul, and maybe even a 5+ feel no pain, it's really going to be a pain to gun down. I think broadsides might be one of the most terrifying units to watch in the Codex. They're 75 points base now, though I think that they don't any longer have to take the plasma rifles or smart missile systems. They can just take the railguns if you want, and basically you can have any combo of weapons or support systems on the shoulders, though you can only have one secondary weapon system. Statline wise, they've got a lot more tanky, with an extra 2 wounds and +1 leadership, plus they're a core infantry unit now, meaning that they can make some very good use of light cover. These things being core I think is really quite a scary prospect. They can put so many scary shots down range, and it means that they can also access some of the very best buffs that the Codex has to offer. They can take a fair amount of the standard crisis support systems, and they have a couple of unique ones of their own too. Stabilized optics can allow them to move and ignore heavy weapon penalties. I think that will be a pretty tempting one to make sure that they're just not completely static gun turrets, and they're the only models that can take the advanced targeting system anymore. Previously that was a near mandatory one on really quite a lot of suits, and in its new version it doesn't give you any more AP, but 6s to hit auto wound the target, which seems pretty murderous, particularly on the variants with all the missiles. Of course its main weapons have also seen a tune-up. Those heavy rail rifles are now heavy 2, strength 9, AP -4 and damage D3 +3, successful wound rolls also giving you a mortal wound, and the high yield missile pods are a big 8 shots at 30-inch range, strength 7, AP -2, damage 2, so lose a bit of range but gain a bit of AP to make up for it. The missile pods currently cost 10 points more than the rail rifles. Finally, they've also gained a little bit of combat in themselves, again hitting very badly in melee, but they get strength +1, AP -1 and damage 1 due to being big weighty battlesuits. In general, it does look like if you just want pure downrange firepower, Broadsides do seem like they could be the most efficient unit in the Codex for that, and that's pretty crazy on a core unit where you can put many additional buffs. Could be quite interesting with broadsides in Mont'ka as well, being able to move and shoot for no penalty, and meaning that you still get a fair amount of mobility without having to worry about the moving and shooting penalty. So that's most of the Battlesuits done, unless you're counting the Stormsurge, which we'll get onto. Next up, let's go through some of the fast attack. First up, the tactical drones return. They're maybe not all that changed, though of course they have lost the Saviour Protocols thing, which will make them a bit less of a linchpin unit for the army. Gun drones are 8, marker drones are 10, and shield drones are 12. They all have 10-inch movement now, the same as the crisis suits. Gun drones retain the rule where they shoot the closest enemy unless there's a drone controller nearby, but they do look like they put out a fair amount of shots for how much they cost. The shield drones are +1 wound and no feel no pain type save. I think they seem a little bit pointless to be included in the tactical drone squad, to be honest. They're not really tanking any ablative wounds for anything else other than other drones. And marker light drones do seem a little bit improved now. They can move and fire those marker lights, and it essentially means they hit on 3s now due to that action. I think maybe cheap units of mobile marker drones might be one of the best ways to go with these now. I guess if you did want masses of strength 5 firepower, then combining some gun drones with a drone controller might be quite good, but mass strength 5 isn't really something that Tau really struggle with too much. Moving on to the Pathfinders, and these are now just 90 points for the squad. Again, like the Fire Warriors in the troop slot, they do appear to have received the same slightly unfortunate squad flexibility rules, meaning that you have to take 10 of them now, no more and no less, besides attached drones. I guess the points cost reduction does take a bit of the sting out of that though. These guys still seem pretty useful. They are core infantry, and they appear to have the Fire Warrior keyword for certain stratagems. They'll still put out a bit of pulse fire, and can of course cover the enemy and loads of marker lights. Both the Ion Rifle and the Rail Rifle both seem like pretty decent upgrades as well. The Ion Rifles are big 3 shots at strength 8, AP -2 and damage 2 when you overcharge. That's seriously impressive for a 14-point model really. And the Rail Rifle's only heavy 1, doesn't overcharge but is damage 3, and each successful wound roll deals a mortal wound 2. They gained a couple of new fancy options in that upgrade kit that they got recently. One of them is a grenade launcher that costs an extra 5 points. That one's got 2 different firing modes, either a fusion grenade that fires off at strength 6, AP -1 and damage 3, or perhaps more interestingly an EMP grenade, where if it hits a vehicle then that vehicle counts as half wounds remaining for the purposes of their damage tables. Again, the drones are part of the unit, reducing a bit of complexity there. The grav inhibitor just bakes in that -2 to the charge, kind of handy, but they can access it anyway from the photon grenades. The recon drone packs a burst cannon, plus ignores light cover for the Pathfinder unit out to 18 inches. That one costs 15 points, and the pulse accelerator drone is one if you want to spam a load of pulse carbines in the squad, giving them all AP -1. Overall, they do look like a fun unit, pretty cheap for what they do I think. With those heavy weapons, they put out a surprising amount of firepower as well, for basically a support unit. Next up we come to Piranhas, which are 60 points per model, down from 63. Again, +1 toughness to toughness 6, +1 wound to 7 wounds, and +1 leadership to 7 as well. They're perhaps a tiny bit more threatening on their base gun profiles. The Piranha burst cannon goes up to strength 6 from 5, and the fusion blaster is always d6 +2 damage now, but still gets the extra 2 if it's within half range, going up to a big d6 +4 if you manage to punch a wound through. If you like, Piranhas can be used to outflank for free, so basically come in within 6 inches of a battlefield edge and outside 9 inches of the enemy. Though to be honest, as they are really fast and have a great move already, I'm not sure how necessary that really is. I guess it could be handy enough if you need to snag things like engage on all fronts perhaps. They still could be a potentially interesting unit for deploying gun drones as well, 1 command point to just chuck out a squad of 6 of them to annoy and harass the enemy. Next, they do seem to have been nice to the Tau auxiliaries in this codex. Vespid Stingwings are now 12 points down from 14, so a bit more efficient on that point of view, and also I've seen a couple of damage buffs. They're now strength 4 and AP -1, where they used to be strength 3 and AP 0. But more importantly, the Neutron Blaster is now 18-inch range, Assault 2, Strength 5, AP -3 and Damage 2. It was honestly a bit rubbish when it was only Damage 1 I thought. Supposed to be the sort of gun that's usually good at killing Space Marines, but can't really do that well when they're 2 wounds themselves. At 60 points per squad they can pack out a surprising punch, but again are one of the units that really fold quite easily to any sort of incoming firepower. Maybe could still be a threatening unit that can also do a bit of grunt work with actions and objectives as they move around very fast. Finally, before we move on to tanks, I'd just like to cover the Firesight Marksman and Sniper drones, which are part of the Elite's choice, but I'd realised I'd not covered them up to now. They're now all bought together for 70 points. You just get the Firesight Marksman and the 3 Sniper Drones. There's no longer the 2 slightly weird separate datasheets. The Marksman's now just Ballistic Skill 2+ on his base profile, not using a targeting array or anything. He also became Leadership 8, and his buff to the Sniper Drones allow them to hit on a 3+ and target characters. He's got a stealth field that now prevents him from being shot unless he's the closest visible enemy unit, or unless the enemy manages to close within 12 inches of him. And those Sniper Drone profiles are 48-inch range, Rapid Fire 1, Strength 5, AP -2, and Damage 1, 6s on mortal wounds. Still though, with this new profile, I don't think I'm enormously convinced that it's actually going to make them worth it. Previously, the Firesight Marksmen were often just used to farm marker lights. Now you can't take them independently for that. I'm still not sure that the Sniper Drones are really good enough to truly threaten characters reliably, and particularly not if they're outside rapid fire range. Moving on, we come to the Tau tanks, the Hammerhead, Skyray, and Devilfish. The Hammerhead's certainly one of the units to fear from the new Tau Codex, I think. 145 points base, and it costs an additional 10 points to upgrade to either Accelerator Burst Cannons or the Smart Missile Systems. Smart Missile Systems retain their Ignores Line of Sight and Ignores Cover and have the AP -1, but those Burst Cannons are kind of an interesting choice now, really quite fearsome vehicle mounted things. They're both Assault 8, Strength 6, AP -1 and Damage 1. Really quite a lot of firepower, though of course you do have to get quite close. Otherwise, in profile changes, it gained 1 wound to 14 wounds. Its ballistic skill dropped to a 4+, though instead of having the 3+ to hit, the targeting array now means that you reroll 1 hit roll every time you shoot. If you're packing a railgun, I strongly suspect it's going to be that. Of course, the main event is that mighty railgun. It's now Strength 14, AP -6, Damage D3+6, a one-shot gun with a massive range. If it wounds the target, it also deals a flat 3 mortal wounds, and it cuts straight through invul saves. I've already done a full Hammerhead review from the Codex, so feel free to check that out if you'd like to. I do go into a bit more of the maths there. The Ion Cannon is a big heavy 3d3, sorry not heavy 2d3 here, another typo there. And that's Strength 8, AP -2 and Damage 3 when you overcharge. It's 10 points more than the Railgun, and to be honest it really does feel like the inferior option now, even if that's a very nice generalist profile. Otherwise, for upgrades, vehicle support systems are gone. They've just decided to do away with things like multi-trackers and things altogether, and Seeker missiles, as we mentioned previously, have changed a touch. They're now Strength 9, AP -3, Damage 2d3. You can launch them yourself, or you can fire them with that stratagem. For 5 points a pop, they don't seem too bad. Could add a bit to the Alpha Strike. Overall, I genuinely do think that Hammerheads probably are going to be one of the units that's played quite a bit. I'm not sure for raw damage output if they're really quite as good as the broadsides, but they are pretty mobile, and cutting through invul saves just means that they're amazing against really hard targets. For the Skyray gunship, that's now 135 points base. It gets largely similar changes to the Hammerhead, ballistic skill 4, an extra wound and things. It packs 2 marker lights, and all those Seeker missiles are now represented as just a single weapon profile, D3+1 missile shots at the Seeker missile profile. Just in general, it is fairly threatening, maybe not quite as much massive damage output as broadsides or the Hammerhead. Though it does come into its own a bit against aircraft, you get +2 to hit against them and can re-roll damage rolls. Finally though, for Tau armor, the Devilfish in the dedicated transport slot is looking like a really decent workhorse for the Tau Fire Warriors. That one's also gained a wound to 13 wounds, and its single burst cannon is a fair bit more threatening as it also becomes an accelerator one as above. Kind of weirdly, it gains a special rule depending on whether you pick Mont'ka or Kauyon. If you're being a Mont'ka army, then you get a pre-game move of 9 inches, which is pretty mad. And if you're Kauyon, then you get to go back into strategic reserve if you're within 9 inches of the edge of the board. I must admit the sheer threat for the Mont'ka one does sound pretty terrifying. If you know you've got first turn, you could just trot up into the midfield, and then use that 1 command point stratagem to move and then disembark a whole bunch of breachers right into the midst of the enemy, hopefully cause a massive amount of carnage, and gun down a serious amount of enemies turn 1, hopefully have them fighting within their own deployment zone before they can even think to advance into the midfield. I feel like Devilfish with breaches inside of them is something that's really going to see play. I've no doubt that we'll see a bit of Fish of Fury fighting style in the new book. Moving on to the flyers, and both the Razor Shark and the Sun Shark have both been up-pointed quite a bit, but also do a lot more damage than they did before. The Razor Shark Strike Fighter is 155 points from 118. It's gained Toughness 7 from Toughness 6, though interestingly still remains at a 4+ saving throw, kind of at odds with the vast majority of vehicles in 40k. Damage-wise though, this thing's a lot more threatening. Again, the burst cannon that it packs has become an accelerator one, but really the main thing are those quad ion turrets, which now when you overcharge them are 8 shots at strength 8, AP -2 and 2 damage, double the shots they were before. That plus the Seeker missile changes makes this thing look a lot more threatening, though I think you're still perhaps paying a premium for the mobility and making sure that it can get line of sight on key targets. The Sun Shark's up to 165 points from 140, that one remains at toughness 6, and this one's pulse bomb has been rewritten a bit. Now it seems to have the exact same rules as, say, the Archaeopter Fusilier from the AbMech. When you pass over a unit, you roll a dice for every model in the unit. On a 4+, they take a mortal wound, and you get to roll 6 dice per vehicle or monster, up to a maximum of 10 dice in total. Usually means that if you're targeting a vehicle, you'll often get 3 mortal wounds, or targeting a big squad, you'll usually get 5. Otherwise, those interceptor drone ion rifles really put out quite a lot of shots now. They will only be hitting on 5s, but that's at heavy 6, strength 8, AP -2 and damage 2 when they're overcharging. So again, that's a very serious amount of firepower, even if very inaccurate. Next up, we come to the biggest gun in the Codex, and the mighty Stormsurge, which, considering Lords of War don't seem to be very favoured by Games Workshop these days, does look really quite threatening and scary for its cost. I think Guard players, you really don't want to compare a Baneblade to this, unless it's to hope for what might be to come in a new Guard Codex. Its base cost is 330 points, and it's basically seen some colossal stat line and weapon improvements. It gets +2 movement, toughness 8 from 7, 22 wounds from 20, and a 2+ armor save from a 3+. Perhaps the single most surprising thing though is that it now gets a 4+ invul save just at base. I don't know if that's to represent the shield generator type things on either side of the model. In any case, this thing looks like a massive pain to remove now, and also packs a very nice amount of firepower. For the main weapons, I think I much prefer the Pulse Blast Cannon, which does cost 10 points more. The big profile is heavy 2, 24-inch range, strength 16, AP -4, and the mental damage of 12. Though against heavy infantry, you can swap for a strength 12, AP -2 shot with damage 4 and 6 shots. I think the driver cannon might be a bit inferior. It does do a little bit more work against heavy infantry. It's 3d3 shots at strength 10, AP -4 and damage 3, so it does have the AP advantage at least over the blast cannon. Otherwise though, it is absolutely covered in other secondary guns. The cluster rocket systems have all become AP -1, and the destroyer missiles are more threatening than ever. They're now a big strength 12, AP -5 and damage 2d3. You can only fire 2 of them a turn. It's finally got a little bit of combat threat. Its thunderous footfalls are strength 8, AP -2, damage 2, though you are still hitting on 5s. And for its stay still and shoot better rule, the stabilizing anchors will now mean that you can reroll all hit rolls if you do an action in the movement phase instead of moving. Overall, I think that these guys look really interesting indeed now. The massive gun is really threatening, and on top of that, it really does pack quite a lot of secondary firepower. It might even be enough to overcome the disadvantages of being a Lord of War and actually see some competitive play. Next we have the Fortifications, the Tau Tide Wall, Shield Wall, Drone Port and Gun Rig for 80 points plus drones and 125 points respectively. To be honest, these things haven't enormously changed since their last incarnation, basically kind of transport models that fire warriors can fire from. They now also have to be weirdly moved via an action that only lasts in the movement phase. Otherwise, the shield wall has gained a 5+ invul save but doesn't reflect shots anymore. All parts of these are now only toughness 6, not toughness 7. Embarked drones on the drone port will hit on a 4+ and can target units freely. Not too bad if you're packing a few gun drones there, I guess. And the gun rig essentially fires with a ballistic skill 4+ railgun, heavy 2, strength 12, AP -4, and damage D3 +3. Any successful wound rolls causing D3 mortals on the target. Mercifully, unlike the Hammerhead railgun, this one doesn't ignore invul saves or anything. I think it would have been a bit disappointing if the best gun platform on the Tau Codex was this weird fortification thing, as opposed to the actual tanks and units. Finally, to wrap up, let's go over the HQ choices, and probably one of the most interesting changes that they've made are to the various flavours of Commander. They seem to have made a big effort to make the Crisis Commander, Enforcer Commander and the Cold Star Commander all just that little bit different. The Crisis Commander remains at 90 points base cost, he's gone up 1 wound, gets a 10-inch movement, and gone up to Leadership 10 as well. His weapon and support system slots are even more free than the regular Crisis suits, he can take up to 4 of any. Again, he has the extra points cost for duplicating more guns than 1, and just at base, most of the guns cost a little bit more in the first place, aside from the Flamer. He can take the Shield Generator, and he can take an Iridium Battlesuit, both of which cost you 10 points each. I think it's quite nice that these guys can just pick up an Iridium suit now if they want, and basically every flavour of commanders can now allow you to reroll 1s to hit for nearby core units. Quite nice to give them the Captain Reroll Hit Rolls aura. The Crisis Commander in particular allows you to give 1 core Crisis unit the ability to shoot or charge after they've fallen back, and also ignore any hit roll modifiers when they're shooting as well. Those are two pretty excellent buffs for the crisis suits. To be honest, it is quite nice that they can remain in melee and still shoot, but it's still usually going to be optimal to drop back if you can. It means that you can jump out of combat and then have the right units in your army trying to deal with whatever was engaging them rather than forcing them to. Overall, he just looks like a really solid leader for actually supporting the suits into battle now. Finally, one other support system that the commanders get access to that the others don't is the positional relay. This one's a support system that can allow you to get units out of strategic reserve one turn early, so essentially in the first battle round, provided they come on within 6 inches of the bearer. I guess could be okay to amp up an alpha strike. You could maybe put that on a cold start battlesuit and run it along the flanks. Next up, the Enforcer battlesuit costs 110 points base. His movement's only 8-inch movement, so you're basically trading some points and faster movement for much better protection. He has a 2+ save base, again has gained a wound compared with his previous profile, and now has -1 damage baked into him as well. Combine this guy with one of the durability relics from the Codex, and it does look like you could have a very tanky battlesuit on your hands. His buff's also a little bit different to the regular commander. Rather than giving them the fall back and shoot thing and ignore penalties, instead he gives one core crisis unit OBSEC instead. Could be handy for aggressive battlesuits smashing their way into the middle of the board, and hopefully taking the points from the enemy. Finally, the Cold Star commander has dropped down to 100 points base from 120, though he has lost a fair bit of movement. Again, he's gained a wound, but he is -6 movement to 14 from 20, and instead of that very fast ability to advance a massive 40 inches, that's now replaced by a once per game jump ability, where he can basically jump up into the air and basically teleport to anywhere outside of 9 inches of the enemy, so basically a free redeploy once per game. Otherwise, his buff is unsurprisingly to make crisis suits a bit faster. One core crisis unit within 9 inches can auto-advance 8 inches rather than rolling, and he still has the option for that high output burst cannon as well. That one's a 15-point weapon, assault 10, strength 5, AP -1 and damage 1. I must admit that option does look pretty decent for the points in my opinion. I'm honestly not too sure which way people will come down with these. They all seem to have their own merits. The crisis commander's cheap and his buff's handy. Being really tough and having objectives secured is handy, as is massive speed. Next up we have the unique commanders, Shadowsun and Farsight. Shadowsun's gone up a little bit, 150 from 135. Her battlesuit's a little bit tougher, at strength and toughness 5, 7 wounds and has a movement of 10. She's a supreme commander now, and the main benefit that she's got is that she has chapter master rerolls, making one core unit reroll everything to hit. That seems truly excellent with things like broadsides and crisis suits. I think broadsides in particular will be a very reliable way of using her. Otherwise, her guardian drone allows you to only be shot if she's the closest target. The command drone gives you plus 3-inch range to her auras and command abilities, and if she's on the table she must be your warlord. She has the redeploy Kauyon ability. If you're rejecting the Ethereals, Firesight's an 130 point character. He has 1 extra wound and a 10-inch move, plus 1 attack to 5 and his leadership 10. His plasma rifle basically gets a bit more range and 2 shots, so it's still pretty threatening. And that Dawn Blade makes him the best Tau melee combatant by quite a bit, hitting on 2s with strength 10, AP -3 and damage 3, or having a sweep attack mode for double attacks at strength 6, AP -2. He has the same buffing ability as the standard crisis commander, fall back and shoot or charge or ignore modifiers for 1 crisis unit, and as well as that he has a quite fun ability to give 1 core unit +1 to hit in melee, just in case your battlesuits did want to get up close and personal and beat down some enemy infantry. The Fireblade is 50 points, same as before. His ballistic skills only 3+ now, and his weapon skills 4+, though his ranged damage output still isn't too bad. His pulse rifle is amped up a bit compared with the standard issue. It's AP -2 and damage 2. I think his buff's still interesting. Unfortunately, it's a little bit less range dependent than before. Basically, if you got a pulse weapon within 6 inches of him, then you get exploding 6s to hit. As well as that, he can give 1 Fire Warrior team within 9 inches, reroll 1s to hit as well. So if you are looking to get the most out of Fire Warriors and Breachers, he seems like a pretty reasonable HQ to choose, nice and cheap. We already talked a little bit about the Ethereals earlier. Their main things are their new litany-like invocations, which give you things like a Feel No Pain or a command point. The standard Ethereals leadership 10, the Honor Blade's a bit more threatening at damage 2, and the Hover Drone costs 5 points more and gives you a 10-inch move. They also all have that ability to make 1 unit fire while doing an action. Could be handy if you've got Fire Warriors that want to be raising banners and things. For just a few points more than a standard Ethereal though, both Ornvar and Ornshi look interesting. Much like that Relic stave that they get, Ornvar and Ornshi both allow you to do invocations on a 2+, and they both know 3 invocations and can enchant 2. Ornvar's a bit tankier as he comes with 2 different bodyguards as well. Both of those haven't really changed all that much besides having the new Honor Blade profile, and the paradox of duality makes them harder to kill as well, a 5+ invul and -1 to wounds. He also gets a 9-inch bubble for his leadership of 10 as well, so he does have a fair few advantages over the standard Ethereal. Ornchi is 85 points, and is a bit better at melee at strength 5, AP -2, damage 2. Again, he knows 3 invocations and can chant 2. No longer knocked to just Viola Sept, he can be taken in others as well, as he is a bit of a commander. And he's got an extra aura where he can either hold steady or set to defend, potentially allowing a bit of boosted overwatch if you're using it on Tau units nearby. Out of these guys, I do think that the Ethereals do look like a fairly strong option. The Feel No Pain plus command point farming looks good on itself alone. I'd either want the base one with the relic, or one of the upgraded ones for a few extra points. Finally, we come to Darkstrider and Longstrike, the Tau Sept characters. Darkstrider's this chap with a nice new shiny model. He's gained leadership 9 and a 4+ save now, and his Pathfinder Pulse Carbine has become a 24-inch ranged weapon, strength 5, AP -2 and damage 2. His little drone accomplices give him a rule that allows him to reroll 1 hit and wound roll each time he fires it as well, so the firepower coming out of that should be pretty reliable, even if it isn't loads. Really though, you'd most want to take him to give 1 Tau core unit +1 to wounds. All you have to do is select 1 enemy unit that's visible to Darkstrider. The range doesn't matter anymore, so it does look like he could be sitting around supporting things like broadsides or crisis suits. It does appear that the buff works on them as well. Otherwise, it does appear that he can use his marker light even after moving. Non-Battlesuit core units can fall back and shoot in an aura around him, and it does appear that he's remaining locked to Tau Sept. You can't take him in other armies. To be honest, the +1 to wound alone seems like it's pretty worthwhile. He seems a very nice little support character, though maybe not the most essential model in the entire HQ section. Finally, we have Longstrike, who's 160 points base, dropping a fair bit down from 185, though he has lost a couple of benefits, including Ballistic Skill 2+, he now hits on 3s. He's got most of the relevant hammerhead changes as well, including +1 wound and the weapon changes, and other than hitting on 3s, his other 2 special rules are a +1 to wound against monsters and vehicles for himself. That might actually make the ion cannon a bit more worth it, as it might struggle to wound a bit more than the railgun does, and he also gets to lead 1 hammerhead within 6 inches of him, basically allowing it to fire as if it had a marker light, even if its target doesn't have one. Definitely a far cry from the big bubble of +1 to hit than he could do before, but if you want a 4th hammerhead on the board, and a very accurate one at that, then Longstrike seems like a decent deal. So with the HQs done, I think that just about brings us to the end of our Codex Tau review. Certainly a massive boost for the Greyskins in Battlesuits, and I've got no doubt they'll be propelled somewhere in the general direction of top tier armies by this update. I think it just remains to be seen whether or not they really are one of the armies to fear, or whether they'll still have trouble taking and holding objectives, with a lot of their units being at least relatively fragile and not really wanting to get too close to melee if they can help it. Hopefully I'll be making a fair few Tau videos over the next week or so, perhaps a few more unit reviews and guides to the faction, so feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics if you'd like to see more like that. Finally, if you have been enjoying all the videos on the channel, I would just like to mention that Auspex Tactics does have a Patreon page, and you can find that down in the video description below. Making these massive Codex reviews does take an enormous amount of time and effort. This one in particular has been a bit of a struggle while fighting a hoarse voice, so if you have been enjoying regularly, any support is enormously appreciated. I do try and give a fair few rewards to patrons, things like seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things happen next on the channel, and automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways with a chance to win some really big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good to you, or you'd just like to help support, then the link is down in the video description. In any case, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.